Alrighty, so I wanted to talk today about why it's important to study snakebite in the places where it actually happens. But I'm going to kick it off by giving the bad news before we give anything. So the interesting thing, this graph shows that the last 50 years, the number of publications that use the words snakebite in various imitations has grown astronomically, and particularly after snakebite got onto the neglected tropical diseases list. And that looks great. It looks like snakebite's undergoing a renaissance. But the real problem is that the broader picture, the geopolitical tide around the world, as some of you probably know, is turning, and it's not turning in a good way for poor communities all over the world, whether they're bitten by snakes or whether it's other health problems that they have. In fact, there's a paper in the Lancet from back in April that I've referenced on the bottom of this, where a couple of authors have decided that the best way to describe the current situation is to encase it in the word the enshitocene. And they talk about the enshittification of public health as a result of political indifference, people just not wanting to invest in the health of others, a loss of that inherent sort of will that we had to try and develop other parts of the world and raise the standards of people. Unfortunately, snakebite, which got onto the NTD list in 2017, is probably going to be a casualty of that. And I would not be at all surprised to see snakebite and probably a few other NTDs disappear from WHO's agenda in the coming years. Problem is, lots of promises were made, but words are cheap. I think that's the best way to put it. Unanimous support from countries to a resolution in 2018 to get recognition of the problem of snakebite, and also calling upon both the countries and WHO itself to take concrete actions to deal with the problem. But not a single country has stepped forward with any funding whatsoever to operationalise that. Donors haven't responded. We've had one major donor who's contributed probably less than, in total, about 3% of what the budget for the work to be done was going to be. Snakebite work in WHO this year has been wound drastically back. We have nobody working on snakebite in a paid position as of January of this year. The only person WHO pays to do anything is me and PQ working on antivenoms. And cold, harsh reality is, thanks to the loss of funding at WHO, there's a huge, reorganisation taking place. The NTD department is losing 61% of its staff. It's being merged with the malaria department. One person will be looking after snakebite, rabies, and about 7 other zoonotic diseases. So the chances that any concrete work is going to get done are about that. That's the situation we're in. Like I said, bigger, broader issues than most of us will ever have the ability to deal with. But I think we have to step outside the microcosm that we live in the research community, in the clinical community, to realise that there are forces in the world at the moment that are basically going to undo everything that's happened in public health over the last 2 or 3 decades. That's a very serious situation. So for snakebite, WHO is going to have to shift gears. And the way in which we do that is in our midterm review of the current roadmap. We foresee that the best way to move forward is to switch towards more country-led interventions, supporting countries with technical information and advice directly around 5 key focuses: health worker training and education, community engagement, which is still vitally important, access to safe, effective antivenoms, building local research capacity so that there can be locally led initiatives in the countries themselves, and then trying to improve surveillance, monitoring, and evaluation of progress. And those will probably be the 5 key things that we have to deal with moving forward, where we're going to be looking more for initiatives that can be led in snakebite affected countries by people who are actually in those countries, with support from donors from within those countries and governments within those countries. because the Western world is not coming to their help. That's been made patently clear by one of the biggest donors to WHO, that it doesn't want that to happen in future. And there are already other countries that are indicating that they may take a similar course of action in coming years. So it is really very dire. My department's going to lose 40% of its staff, I think they're starting to let them know today. So it's a very serious situation. So the best chance really for success is going to have to lie in local initiatives. Countries have got a lot of problems, and sometimes they don't like the West to tell them what to do, when, where, how, and why. Pushing a snakebite agenda from here, and I mean, we're a room largely of Europeans, can sometimes rub people up the wrong way as well. You can go to countries and they will listen with deference and politeness, but they've got their own priorities to deal with. And when you're gone, it gets forgotten about. The only way you're going to counter that is we have to have local champions taking leadership in the countries that are affected. We need health ministers, senior people in health ministries to start to step up and say, yes, we do recognise this is a problem, and yes, it will be put on our national agenda, and yes, we will prioritise it, not just to do things, but to invest money in doing those things. And then, of course, you need all of the other local stakeholders to be elevated and given positions of leadership and control and responsibility. And we on the outside need to support them as much as possible. There are some who feel that the West shouldn't interfere. You'll see a lot of editorials that talk about decolonisation. I tend to think that, yes, while there are some risks, there are a lot of rewards from what we can actually contribute to helping support countries to find their way forward. And I think it's going to become more and more important that we do that if we're not going to just see snakebite and other NTDs disappear completely from the face of public view. So the good thing about this is that people in at-risk communities are great collaborators. I mean, even at community level, people who live in environments where they run the daily risk of snakebite, they're eager to hear about it. They're interested to hear about it, and they want to know what they can do to help themselves. And the same goes in the research and the clinical community. If you can find people who've got a spark of interest and you can ignite it, then you can develop something within the country that's going to be far more sustainable than something that we parachute in as a foreign aid, and then once the period of time for that funding is done, it just disappears, never to be heard from again. So you've got to build these relationships, and I think it's a very important thing that we're going to have to all switch gears and think more of. Because to understand snakebite, if you really want to understand it, you've got to immerse yourself in it. It's very difficult to study any tropical disease from afar and really understand everything that builds into the problem. One of the things this photograph shows, when I first went to Papua New Guinea, there's patients get bitten, they're transported to hospital, all seems very straightforward, until I actually got to ride in the back of a 40-ton vehicle with about 80 people, with this poor lady who'd been bitten by a snake sitting on the floor with a husband, with a drip tied with a piece of string at the top. No nurse, no doctor to accompany her, and she was being shipped 300 kilometres to the national capital to be put into hospital. If anything happened to her during that trip, that would have been the end of it. If her airway had obstructed, if she'd had a significant bleeding episode, she would have died in the vehicle on the way. And of course, from the outside, those sorts of things are just not immediately obvious. The only way you find out about some of these sorts of problems, even problems of just physical geography, the effects of climate, whether there's good communications, what sort of state the health facilities are in, what level of training the health staff have. You're not going to know any of that sitting back here at home in Australia or North America or Europe. The only way you're going to find out is go there and learn yourself. And one of the things about this is that not all of the problems are immediately obvious. Like I said, sometimes it takes time to work it out. And of course, we learnt the lesson from seeing women like that being transported in public vehicles. We recognise that in Papua New Guinea, they needed to have an ambulance service that could deal with these sorts of potential life-threatening emergencies. So our response when we got a trial funding to do a clinical trial, we had a little bit of money left in it, was to put our own intensive care ambulance on the road and close the gap of the maybe 50 or 60 people a year who were dying being transported from one facility to another. And in the time that we did that from 2012 to 2019, when I left P&G, we never lost a patient during transport. If need be, we intubated their airways on the side of the road with a work lamp on the back of the truck. But we got every single one of them to hospital alive, and that was the most important thing. And now what's happened with that is that St John Ambulance several years ago sort of came to us and they had a look at what we were doing. They went away and thought about it. They've now taken it over and they're running multiple intensive care ambulances that not only serve the needs of snakebite patients, but they serve the needs of the whole community for whatever it happens to be. Motor vehicle accidents, pregnancy problems, you name it. So that problem that wasn't immediately apparent sort of eventually ballooned to be something that could solve a lot of problems. And so it's really important that you have first-hand exposure. And you can't do any better than this photo shows of learning from local people, listening to them at their level and learning from their experience, because we need first-hand experience to be able to understand the full context of what's going on around us. And our experience is not necessarily the same as somebody else's. I mean, even if you turn and look at the person next to you, the way in which you're perceiving this talk is going to be completely different, not necessarily going to be the same. What you see in a context in one country won't necessarily translate seamlessly to another country. That can also be a problem. And of course, where you've got a limited experience, you run the risk of bias, you run the risk of subjectivity. So you need to sort of open your mind up and go and see how things are working and be open and receptive to ways that other people do things. And it's not always the easiest or the most risk-free way to do it. Some of the countries where snakebite is a problem, there's substantial personal risk of being there. You know, I've been shot at, I've had home invasions, I've had death threats. I've seen a guy come into an emergency department and chop his wife into little bits and pieces with a machete. There are all sorts of very confronting experiences that you can have when you take this sort of route. But on the other side, you have the ability to potentially literally save people's lives. And in the work that we did in P&G in particular, you know, we saw a situation when I arrived where 26% of children died of snakebite. 15% of adults died. By the time I left, it was less than 1% for both. And that's really the other side of the coin, that there's a lot of personal reward in what you can do and what you can learn. And again, no one size fits all, so you really have to see it at every level. This is a picture of a district hospital in the Western Fly district of Papua New Guinea. So this is a hospital that serves a population of 30,000 people. And it had been suggested to me as a potential site for a clinical study. And we'd heard historically it had been very good. They'd had mission doctors, they'd had lots of staff. When we got there, they had 4 what we call community health workers who were treating all of the patients in this bush lean-to on the grounds of the hospital because all the buildings had been destroyed by white ants. That physically would never have been possible to conduct clinical research there without a very substantial investment. But then we went to other places, of course, the same level where you could do substantially more. And from one country setting to another, there can be substantial differences. It's very important that things have to be flexible. So in Papua New Guinea, we'd implemented a training course for health workers, which ran on a very non-hierarchical basis. So everyone, whether they be a nurse or a community health worker or an emergency doctor or a specialist surgeon, they all went to the same course, they all learned the same things, and they worked alongside each other. When we wanted to transpose that course into Cambodia for their Ministry of Health, it just wouldn't work that way. They have a very hierarchical system. So what we had to do instead was take the senior people and we ran a train the trainers course for them. We got them all up to speed and then we turned them loose on everyone else. And they've been running that course by themselves now for more than 15 years, very successfully. And so same course, basic elements, different technical information in it, but the way in which the course had to be presented and taught had to change according to the circumstances. So clinical research, this is the thing that I've always been interested in the most. We looked at the overall publications on snakebite at the start. This graph shows you something a little bit different. This shows epidemiological studies, retrospective studies, cohort or observational studies, and then randomized controlled trials over the last 50 years. And you can see that when it comes to RCTs, which are the highest level of evidence we should be pitching for, they've got the lowest rate of publications. In the last 5 years, there are only 34. But that's the sort of evidence that we actually need to have, rather than the retrospective studies or the observational studies, which I guess they're easier to run, they don't cost as much, so they're a lot more likely to take place. But we really need to have much more of a focus on building the capacity to do good quality clinical research to answer snakebite questions. Because there's lots of problems and they're all on the slide here for you to read. Higher costs. I mean, what you budget in, say, the UK, by the time the money's going to wherever the study's going to take place, exchange rates are going to inflate that quite a lot. Just changing money on a regular basis. And as the rate changes, you find that you're losing more of your budget than you expected you would. The infrastructure can be very weak. In PNG, we had to bring everything with us in shipping containers. We had to build and set up our own pathology laboratory because their own had been non-functional for years. We had to completely equip the emergency department section that we were going to work in. We had to bring in everything from the syringe drivers, the ventilators, the heart and blood pressure monitors, even the consumables, even the disposable items, the drugs that we used, because we couldn't trust the local supply. And the reason for that is ethics. You've got an obligation ethically to make sure that you're providing the highest level of care to the people who participate in your research. And you've got to apply it not just to those who volunteer to be recruited, but you've also got to apply it to the people who decide that they don't want to be part of it. Because you can't have a system where participation gets you a higher standard of care than non-participation. Ethically, it's just a completely abhorrent idea. So we had to take over the treatment of every snakebite patient and give them the same standard of care at the same expense, regardless of how many actually agreed to participate in the studies themselves. And of course, we experienced all sorts of things. A colleague of mine, when he first went there, he went to his afternoon shift and they had a little corridor outside the 3-bedroom emergency department where they put patients in overflow. When they got to the guy on the end bed, he'd been dead for hours. He was just laying on a gurney with a blanket over him, dead as a doornail. And Simon asked, who is this patient? What's going on? Got the chart. It was a snakebite patient. He'd come in, he was asymptomatic. He didn't have any clinical signs that they could discern. So they thought, well, he's not that urgent. We'll just put him in the corner and come back to him later. And of course, then the afternoon gets busy and everyone forgets. And it was just considered, well, he was going to die anyway. There was an attitude that, snake bites are always going to be fatal. Wolfgang Wuster from Bangor and I were driving on a road one afternoon. We saw a group of guys playing soccer 40 kilometres out of Port Moresby on the main highway. We stopped, we're talking to them, we're talking about snakebite first aid, and one of them pipes up and says, there's a guy in the village who's dying right now. So we go up there as quick as we can, and sure enough, they've got this guy in the house. He's wrapped up in a white blanket with only his face exposed. They're just sitting around waiting for him to die. The highway is 40 metres away. He could easily have flagged down a vehicle and been at the hospital, and his life was saved. By the time we went up there, he'd passed away. They didn't even think that it was possible. They came from a remote area of the country where everyone historically died of snakebite. even though they'd moved closer to town, that was still their belief. So they didn't even make an effort to try and save his life. So these are some of the things that you learn when you're in country and you sort of immerse yourself in what's going on. This was our emergency department when I started. There are 6 snakebite patients in that 3-bed unit that we were recruiting for a study I was doing. There's 3 on beds, the little old lady in the right-hand corner sitting on a chair, guy in a wheelchair getting an IV line stuck in, and the guy in the blue shirt at the very back was standing over his mum who was laying on the floor because there was no bed. That emergency department, when I first got there, this is a tertiary teaching hospital, had 1 stethoscope for all the doctors and 1 manual blood pressure machine for all the doctors, nothing else. And I used to go in to collect blood every 6 hours. I used to sleep on a cardboard sheet in the doctor's office and set an alarm to get up and go and collect the blood and collect the observations, because that was the only way it could be done. So there can be very challenging environments. If you really want to do it, you've got to be there. You have an opportunity, though, that you can build a team of people who are capable. What we found is that many of the doctors working in this environment, again, they'd given up. They didn't think there was any hope that they were going to be successful, so they didn't really try very hard. When we came along and with a few fairly simple interventions, basically just doing things quickly, observing patients well, deciding when antivenom was needed and making sure they got it, and supporting airway and breathing, and people started to survive, all of a sudden we had lots of doctors saying, can we come and work for you? Can you, can we do things? And so we very quickly built up a team that was very interested and active, and the more experience they got, the more capable they became, to the point where eventually they didn't need our help at all. But for clinical trials in low income settings in particular, the only way to really do them properly is to be there. I lived in Papua New Guinea for 20 years. I lived half a kilometre from the hospital. If I wasn't there all night in the office, I could easily be backwards and forwards 5 or 6 times every couple of hours. But they are very difficult to plan. There's a lot of little things, everything from the power supply, the water, the staff not turning up to work because the transport for them never turned up, that can make things a lot more complicated than they need to be. So everything takes longer, everything's more difficult, costs are higher, logistics, all of the reagents for our hematology and hemostasis machines had to be shipped in from Australia. We had to fly up technicians to calibrate the machines and service them every time it wanted to be done, couldn't be done by remote control. But if they are designed well, if you're flexible enough to be able to work out how to do it, they can be done. We were successful in running trials in PNG. I think if you can run them there, you can run them anywhere. And there are lots of questions that could still be answered. I think the most urgent one is that we need RCTs to look at safety and efficacy of doses for antivenoms that we have now and for all these potential new treatments that are coming along. And they're really the 2 questions we want to answer. Interventions to deal with the management of neurotoxic snake bites, cytotoxic snake bites that cause necrosis, like spitting cobras and some of the vipers, would be really useful to see happen. Validation of diagnostic tests. And I was at a hospital in West Africa last year where they get a lot of carpet viper bites. And they report a very high proportion of patients with positive 20-minute whole blood clotting tests. And when I went to the pathology lab, they weren't using glass bottles, they were using plastic tubes. Does anybody know what plastic tubes do? They prolong the clotting, and you don't get a clot in a normal blood sample. So you could be getting a lot of false positives because of the type of glassware being used. Thanks. But point of care technologies could probably replace and resolve some of those problems. And there's also a need to look at things like pathophysiological studies of some of the big syndromes that we see, such as with Deboyer-Rosselli, Deboyer-Siamensis, where you've got problems with capillary permeability, AKI, shock, and longitudinal studies looking at the sequelae of snakebite. We know nothing about what happens to patients 5, 10, 15 years after they've been bitten. But they're not fishing expeditions. You know, if I'm designing a trial in a Western country, I want to get as much data as I possibly can. But realistically, at the moment, the two biggest and most urgent priorities are simply knowing the effective dose and knowing if that dose is safe for whatever type of treatment they're going to get. Because we really don't know for most of the products in the market the answer to those questions at all. So outside of the clinical sphere, lots of other opportunities. You're a herpetologist. Snake ecology, we know next to nothing about snake ecology or human snake ecology, how the two interact with each other in different communities. We know very little about social and cultural determinants of things like healthcare seeking behaviour. First aid for snakebite. Anyone who thinks PIB works, the Australian pressure bandage, deluding themselves. The evidence basis for the use of PIB is very, very poor. We need to have studies to find effective means of first aid that actually work and can be applied by the people who are going to use them safely and effectively. So, talented people should apply. There's a few things you need to be: well trained, well qualified, highly motivated. You need to be independent, be able to work with minimal supervision. You need to be resilient. You need to be resourceful. I would say anybody thinking of going to a low income setting who can't get a car moving again after it breaks down probably should stay home. You need to be a bit of a carpenter, an electrician, a plumber. You need to be a bit of everything. You need to be able to work with people who have come from culturally diverse backgrounds. You need to be able to blend in and accept that some of the things that, you know, you might not like is just the way of life, and you need to find a way to work with that. There's a lot of potential for anybody who's young in their career to go and do some work in some of these countries and create something of value. But it needs people like us. Can't just be solved from the south, can't just be solved from the north. We actually all need to come together. We need to cooperate to try and solve this problem. And to wrap it up, I would basically say that, you know, it needs equal partnerships to create strong teams to get good results. And that's the most important thing. But from our perspective, we need to be lifting people up. We need to be empowering them to be able to do things that maybe they're just not got the confidence to do, but they've certainly got the talent and the ability. Support them, provide what they need. And again, that's my message for the day in this gloomy global health microcosm in shitocene that we're now in, is that there's still lots that we can potentially do. So thanks very much.